Yes. Anyone in particular? You want to start on Iran?
Well, I would love to get your thoughts on what's happening with maximum pressure today and your definition of success.
Okay, well, in all due respect to the foreign minister, we do think our program is working. And the reason why our program is working, let's start with why are we doing this? And the reason why we're doing this is we think that the Iran nuclear deal was a flawed agreement, that Iran should never have nuclear weapons. It shouldn't be a fact of it's a 10-year obligation. It should be a much longer obligation. I think that nuclear weapons pose a tremendous danger for this region, would only encourage further development of nuclear weapons, and not just to this region, but for people around the world. That's the first issue. The second issue is we want regional stability, and Iran has been exporting terrorism and has been creating significant issues for their neighbors. Matter of fact, I was in the region about 6 weeks ago, and it was right after their attack on Saudi Arabia, an unprovoked attack on the nation's energy, which wasn't just an attack on Saudi Arabia, it was really an attack on the entire energy industry and the world economy. So we think there's a terrific opportunity for the Iranian people. We'd love nothing more than to see a real agreement that creates regional stability and peace. And when they're ready, we'll take off the sanctions.
Your Excellency, I would love to get your thoughts on this as well. Do you believe that this is the best method forward?
Well, if we're going to talk about Iran, I think I will leave the political angle of Turkey and the US, but I think if you're going to focus on where Iran stands with the GCC, and I think from the economical point of view, and I think there's a lot of talk about, especially Qatar's economical tie with Iran. And I think if I just give you a snapshot of what was happening in 2018, the GCC trade, for example, with Iran in 2018, and these are public records, so it's available. It's close to what, $14 billion, 13.7, 13.8. And if you look at where Qatar stands in terms of trade, we've done 2018 close to $430 million. So we were about 3% of the GCC trade with Iran. And I think if you look at even down the road, what was behind these things, most of our trade was on agriculture and humanitarian issues, especially after the blockades. And if somebody tells me today what is the most thing that you consume from Iran, I can tell you the aerospace. That's probably one of the most things that we're really consuming, and we had no choice but to go through that. And I think everybody was very clear of what led to this situation.
So you're trying to say that the sanctions on Iran haven't made your life more difficult?
For us, we had limited choices, especially on the aerospace when you had almost a very perfect blockade on our airspace. So the only way for us to access the global market was actually using the Iranian airspace. And I think we've also made it very clear to our allies and our friends that those are the chances that we have, and we have no other way out of this area. Other than this, if you look at where we are today in 2019, we're almost half of the number that we were in 2018.
Mr. Secretary, just a couple of months ago, in September of this year, I visited the Abqaiq facility that had been attacked by Iran, the Aramco facility, and saw the extent of that damage. Obviously, the United States responded by sending US troops into Saudi Arabia, thousands of them. The Special Representative on Iran, Brian Hook, just told me a few moments ago that the attack on Aramco was an act of war. If there is another such attack, what is America's response going to be?
Well, I'm not going to say in advance what our response would be, but I would comment is that our troops are there on a defensive basis. I'd almost just also thank the Emir and Qatar for our presence here. We have a very significant military presence at the base here. Qatar is a terrific strategic partner with us on national security. We've worked very closely with them on combating terrorist financing. And I would also just comment, I was in Bahrain earlier this year where we have the Fifth Fleet. And the Fifth Fleet is there for freedom of navigation. And unfortunately, if it weren't for the U.S. troops in this area, there wouldn't be freedom of navigation. So this is not just about U.S. energy interests, this is about worldwide energy interests and supplying freedom of energy to the world.
Critics of the maximum pressure campaign have said that one of their greatest fears is that by tightening the screws even further on Iran, you risk provoking an already extremely wounded animal. And when animals are wounded, they tend to attack. Do you believe that there could be another attack from Iran?
Well, again, I surely hope there's not, but the purpose of this is very clear. The purpose is to cut off money that is going to fund terrorist activities and instability in the region. And let me just say, the sanctions do allow for humanitarian goods. We've set up a channel. We're working with Switzerland on opening that channel for humanitarian goods. And we support the people of Iran. So there is a good outcome here. Iran is a rich country. We want to see the wealth used to support the people of the country to have a better lifestyle, not to be used for terrorist activities throughout the region.
And walk me through, Your Excellency, the situation today with Lebanon. You've made commitments, monetary, to Lebanon. Where are you with those commitments today? How much money have they gotten, and how much are you going to contribute in future?
I think if you look at Qatar's position with actually most of the regional countries, we've been one of the greatest supporters for a lot of the Arab countries, the Middle Eastern countries that they're going through a lot of economical and political difficulties. We've seen it in some of the Arab Spring countries. Lebanon is not a different. We know that today they are going through some sort of political and economical difficulties. We made a commitment, if I remember that, of $500 million. I know that this is an ongoing matter, and we have a very close discussion with the Lebanese of actually how we're going to take this one forward.
In terms of that monetary commitment, how much can they expect from Qatar?
I'll tell you the way that if we commit something and we announce something, Qatar is always stand by its word.
Given the economic turmoil facing Lebanon today, how close do you believe that country is to actual economic collapse?
Most of our economical activities, even in the region, we've done it during the very difficult time with those countries going through a very difficult economical situation. So Lebanon will not be different. So we will look at Lebanon as a very important country in the region. There is economic and political stability is very important for the Gulf, for the Middle East, and I think also globally. So Qatar will always stand by Lebanon in these times.
Mr. Secretary, I want you to weigh in on this specifically because there are major implications for Lebanon's economy as a result of maximum pressure. Would you give me your assessment of how much of an impact maximum pressure has had on Hezbollah's strategy here? Because it doesn't seem as if it's rolled them back in any way politically. And if you speak to folks close to the political center in Lebanon, they tell me that Hariri may be up for another term as prime minister simply because he's Hezbollah's guy. So how do you gauge the success of maximum pressure when it comes to Hezbollah?
Well, again, let me just say that the maximum pressure campaign is on Iran. I think the situation in Lebanon, in Iraq are both complicated.
But
and
that bleeds in.
I think in both these countries,
Literally.
you're seeing pushback on Iranian forces that don't belong in these countries.
What happens next, though? Because as we were saying, this does bleed in to Iraq and to Lebanon, and it does have major implications. At the end of the day, the United States doesn't want a failed state on the border of Israel.
Lebanon, we don't want a failed state anywhere. That's not the purpose of this. Again, let me just be clear. As you were talking about Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, these are complicated issues right now where there's different forces at play. But the maximum pressure campaign is about preventing money that Iran is using to export terrorism through the region. And I think that's working. Quite frankly, you'd see a lot more of this if it weren't for the sanctions being in place.
I want to take a step back and ask you both to weigh in on what's happening in the global economy today. The IMF is projecting now that we're going to see a slowdown in growth in 2020. I'd like to start with you, Your Excellency, and just get your thoughts on what we're going to see in the coming year.
Well, I think what happened probably yesterday was, I think, a big day. I think not for the U.S. and China, but I think also for global economy. When you had the challenge between the first and second biggest economy globally, that will had some impact. And also we had some challenges in Europe with the UK Brexit. I think today we have some sort of clarity. It's not going to be as a high growth rate that we've seen during the last decade, but I still think that we're seeing a modest growth. We're seeing more challenges in more developing countries rather than developed countries. Still the US, China, India are playing a key role in global growth. In the GCC, still, the geopolitical challenges are putting some weight on that growth. Oil prices start to moderate, so or the Gulf countries are really getting used to those $50, $60 oil prices. Most of the countries they've adjusted their balances and budget toward these type of prices. Still, the growth in the Gulf is I can say, relatively historically low, but I think we're seeing more activities today from the private sectors in most of the Gulf countries.
Mr. Secretary.
Well, first, let me just comment that in the U.S., there's no question that President Trump's economic program is working. And during the campaign, we developed this economic program of tax cuts, regulatory relief, and trade. And you've seen a very, very strong U.S. economy for 3 years. You've seen tremendous job creation, lowest unemployment, with a consumer outlook that looks very strong. So the U.S. continues to be the bright spot of economic growth. We have seen Europe slow down dramatically. Looks like Europe is bottoming out. So although it's not yet growing, it looks like at least the rate of decline. And there's no question we've seen things in Asia slow down. Now, specifically, we've had a very big week for our trade agenda. Couldn't be more pleased. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which is our largest trading bloc. We're going to see that passed in the House next week. I expect the Senate will take it up quickly when they get back. And the China deal, which Ambassador Lighthizer and I have been working on for 2 years, we finally have completed what I consider to be a historic Phase 1 trade agreement. And let me just say, this deals with intellectual property, this deals with technology transfer, it deals with structural agricultural issues. Financial services are opening up, currency understandings, as well as a commitment to purchase U.S. agriculture and U.S. goods. And when I was listening to one of the topics this morning, and the topic of the rules-based system, and this is something I hear often, and kind of the implication that the U.S. is pushing back on the rules-based system. The U.S. very much respects, more so than anywhere in the world, the rule of law. And what we don't respect is where the rules-based systems are not fair and that the rules are not level playing rules, that's what we're pushing back on. So really the deal with China is about creating a more reciprocal trading relationship. For a very long period of time, the U.S. was open to China. China was not open to the U.S. There were very strong restrictions. And for the first and second largest economy in the world, there should be more reciprocal trading back and forth, and that's what we've been working on. And I think both these agreements will not only be good for the U.S., but will be very good for global growth.
In terms of what happens next there, a lot of folks in the market seem to think that some big issues remain unresolved with China. What's the timeline look like?
Well, let me just say, I think people underestimate really what is in Phase 1. And in all fairness, we've been working on this for a long time. I believe we put out fact sheets today. If haven't come out yet, they'll come out tomorrow, which really go through and detail in a very specific way what this agreement is. The agreement's now just going through what we call a language check, since it was obviously negotiated in English, and we'll now have a language check, and it's being initialed, and we expect it'll be fully executed in January. And then we'll get to Phase 2. So, I think we both said the most important issue is let's make sure we implement Phase 1 with an enforceable agreement, which it is, and then we'll start negotiating Phase 2. And there are important issues left in Phase 2. And, perhaps it'll be a Phase 2A, a 2B, and 2C. We'll see. but we couldn't be more pleased with the progress in this part of the deal.
Does the president need this trade deal to get reelected?
The president's going to be reelected almost no matter what occurs, because he's built an incredible economy, and he's very focused on national security. He's rebuilt the U.S. defense posture throughout the world, and I think those are two of the most important issues to U.S. citizens.
Your Excellency, weigh in here in terms of the challenges that you see. Is it enforcing what we're trying to do with the Chinese in terms of this U.S.-China trade talk, being able to enforce these rules, speaking of a rules-based society, or is it the fact that we might see this continuing for years and have, a one world, two systems outcome?
I think it's for everybody's benefit. Us, global market, when you have the biggest two economy indifferences, I don't think this will benefit anybody. And I think the outcome that we've seen this week, I think this is something that everybody is very much positive for it. Market is taking it very well. For example, Qatar has been a capital exporter for most of the last 20 years. So we also have a lot of interest of what's happening globally. So when we have a stabilized global market, that is good for us, good for most of the Gulf countries, and it's good for the global economy. So I think when Secretary Mnuchin mentioned that, opening and accessibility of market, I think in somewhere he's right. It's very important that we have some sort of a level playing field across the global economy.
Your Excellency, I want to ask you, where is your government today with regards to the blockade of Qatar by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others?
I'll take you through an economical scenarios of exactly what happened in the last 2.5 years and prior to that. Most of you know that, the GCC or the Gulf Cooperation Council, they had a big economical, what we call it, economical integration between the most of the GCC. So it's like what you see in the EU. And once the blockade came, it was for us, as a surprise, as sudden. So we had to start moving differently. At that time, most of our, I can say, back of the house was done through the GCC market. A lot of people came and probably some of them even blamed us. Why not having this, or why not doing this? How can you don't have a dairy products? Why you don't have your logistics here? And at that time, there was a very clear understanding on, at least from our side, that if somebody in the Gulf is doing it, we usually try not to, copy it and give the chance to that country. So at that time, for example, we were importing 91%, 92% of our dairy products. All of a sudden, that got cut off. Today, we are a net exporter of dairy products in probably in 2.5 years. For example, airports, we've lost 19 destinations on the blockade. Today, we are up 24. Our airport back to pre-blockade numbers. Our tourism, we're expecting close to 2 million this year. We're at 1.5 until the third quarter.
But are we any closer to having this resolved?
I think today our Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs highlighted this in his sessions, and he had also previously mentioned. We are a big believer of GCC. We were before the blockade, we were during the blockade, and I'm sure that when this resolved, we are also a big believer of the GCC unity.
There were multiple accusations at the time of this blockade between various Gulf countries that Qatar was involved in terror financing. Those were accusations that came from various Gulf governments, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, others. Are you satisfied with where Qatar is today in regards to this?
I am, and let me just comment on, 3 years ago we set up the Terrorist Target Financing Center in the region because we thought it was very important for all the countries to work together on the common threats. And I can't comment on what happened before I became involved in the region, but I can comment on the last 3 years that Qatar has done a very good job working with us. We have a full-time attaché here. We have very close cooperation on security issues, sharing intelligence, doing joint sanctions, and they've just recently passed some very significant laws. So I think they've made an enormous effort in this region on this issue.
So when the Saudis and the Emiratis say that Qatar finances terror, they're lying?
Well, first of all, I would never say that anybody is lying. What I would say is we've had very specific discussions with all of these countries. I was here a month ago where I visited all the countries specifically to talk about sanctions and terrorist financing. And we have close relationships, and we hope they can work out their issues amongst them, because I do think there are bigger regional security issues that everybody needs to be unified on. Thank you.
Your Excellency, final question for you. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister said that if America were to depart Qatar militarily, that Qatar would fall. And there are many who suggest, following the attacks on Abqaiq in Saudi Arabia, that if America were not backing Saudi Arabia, that Saudi Arabia's government would fall. What is your hope when it comes to America's responsibility in the Gulf Arab countries?
Well, first, let me take you through our relationship with the U.S. You know, our relationship with the U.S. is not only on the military side or economical side or political side. I think if you can see today the country, we are demonstrated, we are very close and very trustworthy ally for the U.S. Today we have across the society, we have one of the biggest U.S. campus in Doha. If you look at education, health, technology, energy sectors, we are not shy to say that what you see today in Doha, if you were here 20, 25 years ago, Qatar was different at that time. When we start really our projects in LNG and really partnering with the US, so a lot to do with also partnering with the right countries, partnering with the right companies. So the transformation that you've seen today, this is because of our strategic relationship also with the US.
Is the United States getting it right with their policies, economically, militarily in the region?
With Qatar, or I mean with
the region.
Well, you know, the region is, for the last 40 years, it's been a difficult region, and it's very difficult to navigate. You know, every 10, 15 years we have a major conflict. You know, if you're starting from the late 70s, 80s, 90s, after that, and even today. But I think what really, that this region can come together again, be united, and look for the future.
Your Excellency, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.